Well, awesome. Thank you so much. And let me just get that set up. All right. Awesome. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Well, mm,
There we go.
thanks so much again, everyone, for joining me. Since I already did my kind of 5-minute preview, I have, a few slides that are similar, so we'll just kind of speed through some of those. But welcome back again to Draw With Me. We will be talking about systems thinking and metacognition as how they relates to learning in conservation science. Um, Again, I'm an undergraduate currently at Penn State, and I've done a lot of student-led teaching and student engagement activities as it pertains to drawing and learning. So that's what we will be diving into for today. Before we get into the really small details, I've split kind of today's session up into what I call 3 chapters of information. So we'll spend around 20 minutes. I'll talk a little bit more about coming from a student instructor's perspective, how does drawing work, and the actual details within the Draw With Me program, what we actually did and what its impacts were like. And then we'll spend 15 minutes aligning that to applications within conservation sciences. I'll be going over a few specific examples of drawings that I wish I had seen when I took some of my undergraduate ecology course. And then last but not least, we'll spend around 25 minutes. That includes a drawing activity. So I'll turn that to you all, as well as ending with a Q&A at the very end. So overall today, you've seen this already. Exploring the value of drawing, learning how to engage students, and really developing those drawing activities that could integrate into your curriculum. So as of right now, I just wanted to make sure before I really moved ahead, is there any questions as of right now? Feel free to shout it out or type in the chat. All right, great. I don't think I see anything. Awesome. So heading into chapter 1, let's begin. So again, this is just a recap in terms of why I got into the drawing. I was originally drawn to it. That's how I got into science. I'm still here because of it. But as from a student perspective, I saw that there was not a lot of usage of art. There was a lot more informational use, but not really active application of them, right? So we talked about these being kind of examples of drawing that I thought had a lot of information, but we didn't really use them. This is a continuation from the slide that I had in the preview, but beyond systems thinking and metacognition, the other questions that I asked when I kind of investigated how drawing works from a cognitive science standpoint was, so how exactly do we utilize drawing as a tool in science? So I gave you a diagram. I kind of already talked about what it's called, but these diagrams of, mapping out the players and the relationships between them are called concept mapping. And they're a very useful visual tool to organize and represent knowledge by illustrating the relationships between concepts. Now, I would say concept mapping is kind of your ground level of drawing, which on another note, some students could get very intimidated by the word drawing because they're thinking it a bit more towards like the scientific illustration, like the textbook, like really pretty illustration. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here. So I try to make that distinctions for students when I'm encouraging them to do these types of activities. And second of all, just adding in a second layer of what's called a dual coding theory. So it says that human cognition involves two separate but interconnected systems for processing information. One is verbal and one is imagery. The reason why I'm bringing this up is a lot of the times when you are drawing either, in class or if students are drawing amongst themselves, they're going to communicate, hopefully what they are actually drawing and why they have drawn it in this way. So in kind of a twofold manner, because you're both drawing and you're also verbalizing some of the information, that really helps you integrate those knowledge and really helps you solidify those connections for long-term memory and application. So again, as I said, I've investigated that kind of as a background of why drawing as a student, and I decided to, um, do something as a student. As this is something I was also not too familiar with. I've never done something like this, and I wanted more students to learn about the fact that this could be a very useful tool. Um, so I created these recitations back in 23. I was a second year undergraduate. And as I said, these were a series of four 1.5 hour long sessions, each about 10 to 20 students. So more of a small group situation, but we can talk about how to customize these later on. We did use extra credit as an incentive, given that this was kind of a pilot program back then. And just to briefly point out this, the reason why I chose to specifically do this in an introductory course was because it was, to me, as someone who got interested in science at a sort of a younger age and got sort of those engagement from the art, I thought that engagement in introductory courses are crucial to long-term interest within the subject. So the earlier that we could teach students better ways to learn, the more roadblocks we can remove, the longer they'll probably stay, interested within the subject matter. But again, this is the repeat information with the structure of the recitation. We start and end with the same questionnaire, so there's enough of a comparison for us to see if there was shifts in attitude, efficacy, and understanding within students. We'll talk about the draw with me section of it in just a moment. But for me, from a human physiology course standpoint, I mostly drew organ systems, if you think about it, and then structures and how structures and processes related within those layers of organization. And you'll get to see that in just a second. And third of all, as it pertains to student takeover, we did uh, not individual, we did team-based case study as well as presentation at the very end. So I have a section on that as well. Any question as of right now? Okay, great. Well, I don't see much in the chat, but if there's anything, feel free to message. Feel free to just unmute and let me know your thoughts. But I'm going to continue on with kind of the meat of the presentation with what the program was actually like. So for pre and post session questions, we usually sort them into two categories. The first one is confidence and efficacy based. They are usually either on a 1 to 10 rating scales or they're open-ended. So some examples include literally confidence in your knowledge about whatever topic that we were working on. I feel that I can explain key processes to someone else. And then last but not least, what skills do you want to or have you learned from today's sessions? In the second set of questions, these are the knowledge checks, usually multiple choice, some matching. And again, I split them into three categories, sort of. So one is kind of getting to know the players. So again, from a physiology standpoint, I'll get to more of the conservation uh, examples later on, but from a physiology standpoint, how do we match protein pumps to functions, put events into sequence? And then taking those, taking the structures that you put together apart, right? What happens if I get rid of a protein pump, let's say? What happens if I disrupt a signal or if I added a signal? So these are kind of preliminary examples for students to think through both before we actually start drawing and then after we draw. And then last but not least, so it actually happens on a real world, instance. So reflex when you get poked by a cactus, right? So that's adding in a signal, and how does that fit into the very much like textbooky anatomical, perhaps diagrams that I already drew, right? How does that play into those parts? And overall, I think the main point with all of these questions is essentially using a mixture of questions to really prime student engagement. And again, because we have combined both of the attitudinal sense and the knowledge checks, we get to see if those two align, right? So if the knowledge increasing, is the attitude, is the attitude at the engagement level, or is it, or is it misaligned? And I think that's a part that's very important with regards to student engagement and how it, the evolution of a session like this. So then we'll move on to kind of the second part of where I actually talk about the drawing themselves. So I call it the drawing that clicks. It's just a name. But here's an example of what I would do within one of these 1.5 hour session. I think this would, right? So let me break it down what's happening here, right? So this is an illustration of the nervous system, as it says here. But essentially, what I wanted to point out is that I start out with the very, very macroscopic structures. We talk about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and then I tell students to, the phrase that I always use is to zoom in, right? You understand this bigger system, but what happens what happens within that system, and then what happens within that system, and then what's, it's kind of like the Russian dolls that you have like layers of like many, many dolls, right? So to zoom in and to see what that cross section of that spinal cord looks like. What does the signal transmission looks like at that spinal cord level, and and then going a step further, saying, well, what happens within each of these individual neurons that are making up this relay pathway, right? So I've enlarged this neuron right here. But again, we don't stop there and we say, let's zoom in again and let's look at what happens at the cellular level. What is happening to the cellular environment? How does all of this support what the function of the nervous system is, how the structure support the function? And then again, at the very end, talking about the actual chemical part of the gradient that is being the electrochemical gradient that plays into neurotransmission. And over here, again, as I said, I think from my experience telling students, like explaining to students what you are doing and why you've drawn it this way. So for me, like really the zooming in part and how that plays into the systems that are interacting, the processes that are overlapping is very crucial for them to get why they should start drawing as well. And second of all, I would recommend if you were to try something like this in a course, to seek student input as you're drawing. So ask students what we should draw next, right? Ask students like what the components of maybe like where the arrows should head, what's the next step, what's the next zooming in, so that technically you're the one who's drawing, but I say draw with me, so students have their own drawing at hand and they're kind of following along in that sense. And this sets up really nicely if afterwards you wanted to do a more in-depth case study, then students have their own versions of kind of the class drawing to base that off of. And again, remind students not just what you are drawing, but why and how you are drawing is very important. This is a second example. This is neuromuscular junctions. And again, as that, zooming in principle kind of applies here, we start at the very, like all the way over here. This is kind of the most macroscopic level, and then we zoom in. So fascicles, and then we zoom in again, we zoom in again, and then we zoom in again, right? So at the end of this with the actin and myosin, this is again at the protein level of how muscle contractions work. And for these type of, and the reason why I draw these type of like gigantic diagrams is as we iterate through the process of zooming in, students can come back and first of all see how the parts of the zooming in overlay on top of each other, but they also not just have access to each individual system, but they still have the overview to that overall system laid out in front of them. So when they see something like this, it's much easier for them to say, okay, well, if there's something that goes wrong at the protein level, at the actin and myosin level, but if the system is a part of this, which is a part of this, and it's a part of this, then this is going to impact, overall the way your muscle contracts, the way you function, right? So it's really um, useful for students to think of it in that way. And before I go on to actual case study designs, I wanted to stop here again because I am going relatively fast to see if there was any questions in terms of what I have been talking about.
I think one question that I have, but which I think could be part of a bigger discussion
Mhm.
is about my own perception that I am a poor drawer.
Mhm.
And then students who have varying sort of ability and interest in drawing and kind of representing like the way in which this visual information is presented and just kind of how that's come up or how you kind of deal with those things in the classroom. And maybe that's a like bigger discussion at the end, but that was just something I was thinking about as I was seeing this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for that question. And I think that actually leads kind of nicely to the case study designs that is more geared towards how to engage students, because we've shown here from an instructor perspective that drawing can show you the system, but it's about kind of giving students enough support and instructions as to how they can make drawings on their own. So I'll go to the next slide, but this would be kind of a sample case study design that we would do. I split this up kind of into four sections again. Um, but first, to kind of set the scene to give some kind of interesting background information. In here, this is more related to the uh, neuron transmission side of things, but someone who is quadriplegic, so paralysis of all four limbs due to damage in the spinal cord. So to introduce some kind of real world applications that students might find a little bit more more interesting to learn about rather than just looking at a purely scientific rendering of the system. And then to kind of pique the question, second of all, to say, can someone who is quadriplegic have a reflex reaction? Can they actually feel the stimulus? And I think this, again, goes back to engaging students who may not have that much interest initially in drawing, or they feel like, um, you know, that this is something that they're not really capable of doing, is coming down to these two, where one, you give a little bit more like detail as to what you're looking for from students, which is why I think, given the fact that I usually do like my own rendering of the drawings beforehand, that gives students a baseline of what that potential artwork might look like. And then second of all, really define the parameters as to what you are looking for in a student drawing. So as have shown here, giving a list of, I usually do it in like a checklist form of what I'm looking for in a student's drawing. So, and be very specific, almost with like some of um, the representation that you are using. And I recognize also at the same time that this could be, limiting in some ways in terms of, if a student is interested in representing this in a different way, or, if there is, again, like if there's different ways of representing it that is different from what I have here on the checklist. But I welcome those discussions, I would say, and it also is a part of the design of the recitation itself, where if students work individually in groups, then at the end they share with each other, and they get to see how maybe another group has drawn it differently, despite being given the same checklist. But in this case, I'll just give you kind of a quick rendition of what I used to do with the checklist. So in terms of just this question in general, we have, X on pathways that are severed, um, the different components of the drawings that they're supposed to include, and the different kinds of neuron and the relay of information. So this would be kind of a drawing that I would be, looking for from students who have already attended those sessions. I wouldn't say it's anything too out of the park in terms of what I have already shown them. And since they've already followed me, this was relatively at the time for students um, enough of information for them to accomplish something like this. And then to briefly talk about student impact before we go on to the more conservation science themed applications. Back when I did these sessions, 81% of the attendees said that they never or rarely use drawing as a learning or review tool. And after these sessions, 98% of the attendees said they would like to see more Draw With Me teaching methods in actual class settings. Some of the key highlights of the skills gained is enhanced information recall, integrative note taking. I think that comes up a lot and is very defining in terms of, I think, just recognizing that drawing, as much as I'm here championing like about drawing and how good it is, it's not a replacement, right, for any other studying techniques that you have, but it's rather a bigger, a part of the puzzle in terms of putting together a drawing strategy that works with you. So a lot of students said, right, creating visual maps to pair with class notes. It's essentially a chart that helps them sort through the class notes in shorter amount of time and also being able to retain it for longer, which I think is amazing. And again, breaking down the bigger picture with all of the zooming in effects and turning ideas into pictures. And just another note quickly on here, I think going back to how to encourage students to draw when some may not have the quote unquote artistic skill is to almost have it in, like, if you think of it like a dress up game design, right? Like you already have like the pieces of the clothing there, right? You have already some initial representation of the concepts. So if students are having trouble kind of bridging that from, coming up with uh representation from scratch, which is arguably very hard to do if they have never done something like this before, having some kind of standardized representation, the bits and pieces, and then have students kind of putting them together like a puzzle would be another approach that I would take. And then this goes back to the questionnaire that I talked about with confidence levels. So one being, I feel like I can explain key processes to someone else. That increased from a 3 to 6 across the sessions that we did, as well as the percent accuracy on knowledge check questions increased from 45% to a 73% accuracy. So here, this is mainly just to show that it wasn't just about accuracy, and I want to make the note that we do not explicitly talk about the answers to, the knowledge checks within the session itself. We merely just go through kind of those diagrams that I have shown you about, like, better understanding how those systems work. But overall, seeing this kind of alignment in both the confidence, so the engagement part of it, and then the accuracy, I think has been something that is very valuable for me in terms of designing these. So I want to stop there briefly again to see if there was other questions before I move on to the actual applications. All right. I don't see anything. So Moving on to chapter two on drawings in conservation science. For those who just joined shortly ago, these were right now I'm about to show three examples of systems within conservation science that I had personally wished we did some sort of drawing activities when I saw them in my intro to ecology courses. Um, but again, like physiology, conservation science involves an understanding of how parts of a system work together, and then how drawings, can really model these relationships, right? I think that's kind of the main point of my entire presentation. But we'll start with impacts of invasive species. I thought it was cool that also a lot of other presenters are, working on some of the examples that I'm about to show you. But again, with ecology as well, I start from the macroscopic level, the entire forest community. Again, I zoom in on individual plants in this case, right? So showing students the before and after of what it would look like when you have an invasive species, and down the line, how that impacts soil conditions was what I learned back in my ecology course, where the different types of makeup of species can impact your leaf litter decomposition, your root exudation, which overall is going to change the metabolite makeup within the soil, thus changing your soil pH, soil organic matter, altering microbial community that uses those metabolites as substrate, and then again affects respiration. So overall here, this is just more of showing that there's a sequential event of many factors that are involved in soil. There's tons of more details that I could add to this diagram. You could, if you were to use something like this in a classroom setting, you could certainly customize it to whatever you would like. But overall, showing kind of also this cyclical impact of when you have an invasive species, this sequential event can also, circle back to impact the growth rate of the species overall in the system, and then how it comes back to the forest community as a whole. So example case topics that we'd done at the time. So learning about how forest restoration programs might work, learning about the legacy effect in terms of soil conditions, that even when you get rid of the invasive species, it might still take, a very long time for the soil conditions to quote unquote recover. And, talking about things like detections of invasive species, environmental DNA, and identification of those species, is I would say some of the examples that we have worked on that would be cool in terms of visualization. Second example, this is another kind of classic, I would say, like intro to ecology course with the food webs, but I kind of took it a step further here on the lines of, really zooming into things, but understanding how a species might go away in terms of extinction vortex, which is something I thought was very cool coming from that class. But I think this example then, starting from small populations, random genetic drift, and inbreeding, it just integrates a lot of, I think, key concepts in conservation science that would be hard to do if it were a block of text, right? So this whole like spiraling of extinction related phenomenon, and then you could also kind of insert related phenomenon such as bottlenecked pathogen, right, disease transmission in terms of these smaller populations that are losing genetic diversity, how they might be vulnerable to a lot of they may be a lot more vulnerable to a lot of environmental changes as opposed to populations that are more genetically diverse. And on that note, right, coming back from all of this and say, okay, well, if all of this is happening and we no longer have this species, what kind of does it create any sort of like niche opening? How does this impact predator-prey relationships? And again, as I said, some examples on infectious diseases and endangered species and how those programs might work to recover those species as well. And then something just quickly here, I would say the way that I draw diagrams isn't like I wouldn't say, right, this is the most realistic bird that there ever is. Right? And part of drawing that also engages students is, just placing the emphasis on more of the having fun side of things and figuring out your own way of representing things. You could think of what I call like the players within the system as like characters, right? You could basically, in a way, gamify some of these representations that you're trying to create. And I've found that helpful in terms of engaging students as well. And last but not least, I thought of giving an example that's more human related in terms of environmental change, climate change, and vulnerable communities. Um, Again, right here, we'll start with sources of emission and really creating this kind of integrated view of what is happening. Greenhouse gases trapping heat that creates global warming, that contributes to global warming. There's also pollution that is coming from the sources of emission. There's rising sea levels that are also in play, and socioeconomic factors, with the human environmental interactions, they all impact the vulnerable communities. And again, as I do my classic zoom in, it impacts not just individual health, increased disease risk, transmission, but it also impacts family and community health, right? So I've actually zoomed out a little bit here. But there's also a lot of, I think, in this period in time, especially with a lot of, use of um, AI and big data centers, I think this is something, very timely in terms of real world application, um, how these infrastructures that could potentially use a lot of energy and how they might play into a cycle like this. Talking about food and water security, and then what part of public health and prevention program may work to alleviate, right, any of these factors that are contributing to long-term health impacts in the vulnerable communities. So I'll close off here with some just ending thoughts about customizing something like this for your own course. I think the main point I think I'm trying to get at is, you could incorporate drawing in whichever way uh, you want, like into your course. It doesn't matter if it's for like me personally, it was 10 to 20 students, but you could also do it in a large classroom, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You could do it in different ways, right? I personally did it as draw and follow me for a 30-minute time period is usually what I would go for, but you could also shorten that and or break it up into sections if you don't have the 30-minute time period within the classroom to actually dedicate that entirely to drawing. But most importantly, making sure that you are, again, explaining the why and how of why you draw and the value of your instructional method and how the drawing is essentially a model for thinking about, again, the relationships within the system. Making sure, I would say, like personally, when we ran these pilot programs, I could have also done one section, but the reason why we chose to kind of ran four at a time is to make it a little bit more consistent. It also helps you with collecting, I think, initial feedback across, some of these sessions, even if they're just pilot, to get a sense of where your students are at and how they best engage with the activities. You could do it through, as I said, in-class activities. I had a professor that would come around with, iPads to have students draw on it, or you could invite students up onto the podium. There's also live and take-home case studies that I found useful for students to continue on with the discussion after class. Discussion boards are pretty cool, I would say, if you don't have time to do team-based activities in class, as well as worksheets, which is, in a nutshell, kind of similar to case studies. And last but not least, I would really hammer in on the impact of peer-to-peer instructions. Personally, as a student instructors, I was able to act as a liaison between my fellow peers and the instructors of that course. I was able to, I think it was easier for me to make the case coming from a different from coming from a fellow student saying that, drawing was something that helped me, and you should consider it using it too. So try to engage, your teaching assistants if you have any, or just, students in classrooms that, maybe initially when you throw out this idea, they seem particularly interested. So if you're interested in implementing something like this, I would suggest connecting with those students and overall making sure that your applications are discussion based when it comes down to the base of it. Um, but yeah, is there any questions at this time? I think the next part we'll just move into the drawing activities and the Q&A. So I wanted to hear if you all had any comments, suggestions, or just want to talk about any of the slides that I have addressed. Oh, there's something that. Oh, thank you so much.
We have a quiet afternoon group. I'm wondering just among the group whether how many people do use this kind of drawing approach in some of those classes. I feel like in the past, like when I was a student, so much was happening on the whiteboard, and I was doing a lot of drawing as part of my note taking. And I feel like just technology in the classroom has taken us so far away from that and the availability of diagrams that we often aren't maybe building things piecewise anymore, and whether that like access to technology and diagrams or the common use of PowerPoint has kind of dampened people's like willingness or ability to do these drawings themselves and actually use that in their pedagogy as a teaching tool. Um, if others have similar things to share, I really liked all the examples of how you've like to bring this into conservation topics.
Thank you. Yeah, Audrey, I thought that was a very interesting idea in terms of bringing in more of the ethical topics within conservation. Would you like to share a little bit more about like or there's actually a drawing activity coming up. Maybe you could showcase a little bit about what you're thinking about there. Let me see.
Yeah, so I guess I took it in a class when I was learning about GIS because we were learning how to put maps onto, the online platform. And so first he just wanted to say like this is what a map looks like. These are the things that you have to have on it, kind of like your drawings. And then kind of as an introductory class, we just had, everybody drew like the university campus, and then you made the places that you go to frequently, you made them really big. Or if you were a nursing student in this class, for some reason you showcase the nursing part as opposed to the more social science part of the campus and things like that, and how you can't put everything on there, but you've got to pick about which is the right key to put on it. And obviously everyone was pretty invested just because, I mean, first of all, I guess it was an assignment, so everyone had to do it anyway. but people were, it was very interesting to have that conversation. And then we looked at the drawings that people looked at, and then we looked at how the university draws its map or how it looks on Google Maps and things like that.
Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you so much for sharing. I think it really stood out to me kind of the the very hands-on in a different way of how interactive I would say that the maps were used in that class. So I appreciate you for sharing that. Yeah, and then thank you so much to Karen and Cassie for sharing as well. And if there are no other questions, then we'll head into a brief drawing activities. It's nothing major. You just need a paper, a pencil or pen, and your phone. Let's see. So I've kind of made this section as much as I said earlier, kind of providing people with as much as information as they need to draw. I did wanted to make this a bit more flexible because I understand that we all come from different parts of science, conservation sciences, and I didn't want to limit what we were drawing. So um, yeah, and for the next 15 minutes, we'll take a little bit of time. If you all would like to, pick just one concept within conservation science, it could be strictly scientific. And as Audrey and also Amanda, thank you so much for sharing in the chat with a lot of the social aspects of conservation science, which is as equally as important, into identify some sort of system within those concepts and try to draw out, preliminary of how you would represent that through a diagram. And I have here to the right a form that you could use to upload your work with a brief description of what is, within your drawing. So I think we'll take the next 15 minutes or so to do that, if that sounds good to you, Dr. Pratt.
Yeah, I think if we want to have time to share with Q&A, maybe we do 10 minutes and then have time for the discussion or sharing at the end.
Yeah, I agree with that actually. Yeah, forget the 15. Let's do 10 minutes.
Yeah, because I have an idea for what I am thinking about doing, but then I don't know that I would like flesh it out all in this one
Right.
moment, but also really curious to see what others, what comes to mind when they pick a concept.
For sure. Yeah, so let's reconvene at about 52. That's a very weird time, but I think yeah, so go for it. Just it does not have to be fleshed out idea in any sense, shape, or form, but as Dr. Pratt said, it would be very interesting to see what you all come up with. And I'll be here if you have any questions. Feel free to chat me if you have, if you would like any specific suggestions or anything like that. But and I'm also sharing the link in chat here if it's easier for everyone to access. Um, right, this is the form to submit. And then here's also if you would like to go back and, because I did give quite a few examples, so if you would like to reference some of those are linked within the second um, link as well.
one of the things that I'm facing now is like generating something myself where it's hard to have it sort of match what I like would want it to be like in my head, but then also not just guiding students through drawing, but using it sort of as an assessment tool. So a lot of times students are working in groups and they might be prompted to draw something on a poster, and there would be several like considerations for what they might include. So as I'm doing this, I can immediately start to think about how I could use it more to see like how much students understood or could represent related to a particular concept. And I think one of the nice things of, I don't know your thoughts. One of the nice things of working in groups is that somebody who's like more comfortable drawing and illustrating something might be more inclined to kind of take that role than somebody who's less comfortable. But then you also have the disadvantage of some students who might just like opt out from participating in that activity. Um, but I do find it's intriguing and a little bit challenging for me to have it kind of look how I think in my head it should.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the that's also I would say one of the like one of the key feedbacks that I have gotten from students who have specifically done sort of these team-based drawing is that sometimes it's very possible for if there were one students who have drawn before, have the capacity to draw, then it's sometimes it's natural to them to kind of take lead within the team, and in that sense other students within the group, they don't feel as involved. So I think one of the ways that we've been trying to address it, not necessarily in the recitation portion yet, but with a lot of in-class activities that are developed, is kind of related to what I said about providing students with some of the almost standardized puzzle pieces for them to draw so that everybody, it kind of levels the playing ground a little bit better rather than just tell people to like as you said, like it's really hard to draw from scratch when you have never done something like that before. Does anyone else have any comments or would like to share any of their drawings or have any other suggestions or comments?
I just uploaded mine to your thing. I have a hard time sharing because I have this background, so it like my background blocks it, I think. Um, Maybe I'd have to turn it off for a minute.
I could also see if I could screen share from my end with the file that you uploaded.
So I did something that's like related to metapopulation dynamics with thinking about an animal movement through different kinds of matrix habitat. So I thought if we have these multiple populations of some creature that lives in the forest, how do we think about connectivity and movement, um, immigration and emigration into each habitat, and then the dispersal distances, and then what is the matrix in between, whether it's residential or water or farmland. And so my thought was to like have students be able to do a thought exercise
Mhm.
where they could think about what all of those considerations might be. But then the next step would be like, how would you design an experimental study to like actually understand what's going on based on this landscape, and having to identify each like step in an animal's movement for um, it to actually show up in another habitat patch. So,
Mhm.
that was sort of the first thing that came to mind for me.
Very cool. Yeah, I remember learning something like this as well in parts of my, and I remember going actually like into some of the fields to better understand this. So maybe it would work better, I would say, like with like labs that you already do. If you are bringing students out, I think that's a better way of supporting them to better understand the drawings versus the real life if there was opportunity. But yeah.
What about others? I'm curious what concepts in particular people thought this was a good strategy for.
I can go. So this is what I drew. It's not the cutest, but it's a little like food chain system between tamarins and agoties. So like tamarins like eat the fruit, but they don't eat all of it, and then it falls down, and the agouti eats it, and the agouti plants it into the ground, and then it helps grow more fruit trees for tamarins, which will then help more agoutis in the future. It's like just a constant system between the two of them. So it's not very well drawn, but it shows you how it works.
Well, thanks so much for sharing. It looks really cute, and I especially kind of I really love the storyline that was built into it. With the characters, and I think it also goes back to what I was saying about having students almost gamify a little bit of what they're drawing, so it's less about the very rigid scientific textbook feelings that a lot of people
Yes, no,
like. But yeah.
I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed like I definitely thought about the like the zooming in that you kept discussing of that. I needed to zoom in to like each showing of like Tamarin and Agodes live next to each other, but of, like how that all works out and how they benefit. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we have less than a minute left. But if yeah, you did have any more questions, you're welcome to reach me at this email. I just threw it in the chat. Thank you so much again for all of your time and attention today. And I hope this was fun. It was really enjoyable for me to talk about and to share a little bit about what I have done. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I've enjoyed talking to all of you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll see you all back in the main room for our wrap up.